Hello, I'm Jared Rasher, and these are the What Do I Know series of videos. This is What Do I Know About Running the Game, and in this particular video I'm going to give a little bit of a campaign retrospective on the Shadow of the Demon Lord game that I just wrapped up recently within the last few weeks. I wanted to do a video where I recapped what I learned, what I would do differently, and what I would like to do in the future, and if I would do this exact same game in the future. So some of the points that I came up with. First off, I was running in 3-hour sessions. It made things really challenging to bring things in a 3-hour session, and sometimes I think constraint is a good thing, but I think given what I was trying to get done, I would definitely like to, especially if I'm going to keep the same pacing where I want to get an entire adventure done in a session in Shadow of the Demon Lord, I definitely would want to expand out to 4 hours. I think even that extra hour would give time for a few more things that could come up in the session that would drain resources and maybe bump up the challenge just a little bit. Overall, I thought the campaign was really enjoyable, but I do think there were a few times where there wasn't as much challenge as the system seems to present for some people, because the way things got paced, we ended up doing a lot of here is the big thing that you need to accomplish in this session. And that would have given me a little bit more time for lieutenants and mooks and things like that to flavor the story a little bit more and give them a little bit more of a challenge. So yeah, even just that extra hour I think would be an important thing to add if I were trying to do this in the future. I'm hoping that the party felt like the expert level adventures and what they pursued altered the master level adventures. I tried to design that to where the early adventures were giving hints of the wider world. The expert level adventures were actually had several choices that weren't even just immediate choices in the adventure, but had some ramifications for how the end game of the entire campaign was going to wrap up. And I hope, without spelling it out too much, that what the players did actually feels like it contributed to the overall story and how that panned out in the actual end game of the campaign. And it's one of those things that I said, unless I were to run this exact same thing over again in the future and try and limit myself to the exact same starting document and not introduce other things that occur to me, I don't have a good way to judge that, but I'm really hoping that they got that feeling out of that. I wanted to play up the mechanics in story a little bit more, like when something was horrifying or when something caused sanity damage. There were a few times I've definitely felt like I glossed over that a little bit too much, and I wish I would have spent a little bit more time making sure they knew why something was gruesome or terrifying, or really building that atmosphere a little bit more. And I'm going to talk about that more, about the GMing things that I learned, in a separate video. But just for the campaign, there are a few times I felt like it was like, yes, this thing is undead, so you know it's scary. It looks dead and decayed. Boom, there you go. And I should have spent a little bit more time making sure that they felt that dread a little bit. The other problem is that as players took a little bit more over the top or creepier character elements, it was a little weird, especially with like fey creatures, to try and explain them being afraid of the same things as mortals, because if you start reading, say, like Terrible Beauty, fey creatures have a really weird perspective on the universe, and having the same triggers for fear and insanity sometimes makes it difficult for the GM to explain those things in a way that sounds like they should have been upset or afraid by these things. But I definitely feel like maybe because I was trying to remember a lot of times, oh, this is horrifying, this is frightening, this is the difference between them, I think sometimes because I was remembering the fact that the mechanic existed, I didn't streamline it into the narrative as much as I would have liked. So that's definitely something I would like to do in the future, so that it's not glossed over nearly as much. I learned a lot about the game mechanics as I was running this. Clearly, I've read through the rules before I ran it. I shouldn't say clearly. There are people that will wing it and will read a section, and when a relevant section comes up, they'll read another section. I did read it cover to cover, but I did not reread it cover to cover. I kind of spot read it before I ran the campaign, and I definitely did not remember everything as clearly as I should have. Sometimes things would come up in the session that would remind me. Sometimes discussing the game online with people after we had a session would remind me of things. The Sharkbone podcast started doing Shadow of the Demon Lord themed episodes. That did a lot to remind me of things that I was forgetting, or to go, oh wait, there's some nuance to this that you completely missed. And that was a valuable resource. All of that, it makes me feel bad that I missed it, but I like the system enough that I would like to give it another run and try and remember those things. Some of that I will forgive myself for just being the first time I ever ran it. Some of it I really should have reread it cover to cover, taken notes, and done a much better job of prepping myself beforehand. Reading it once and then rereading relevant, crunchier bits of the rules was not enough. I should have been taking notes, and I should have done a lot more prep time to really drill that game system back into my head. So that's something that I take that on myself. I should have done. I was still going to make mistakes even if I had done that, but I wish I would have gone that extra step besides just spot rereading. Oh wait, how does insanity work? Oh wait, how does combat work? How do spell castings, how do castings per day work? I reread those things, but I really should have done a much deeper dive into things. Some of the other things that came up, corruption was a big one. I killed a character with corruption, and they should not have died from corruption. I misread something. I reread this thing twice, and I misread it twice. What happens is, if someone goes past a threshold of 9 corruption, if they die, they cannot be brought back. The forces of darkness decide, no, you're staying here with us. They give them a warm, spiky hug. But the problem is, somehow I managed to misread that passage twice in a row, and I read it as, once you hit 9 corruption, you die, not when you hit 9 corruption, once you become incapacitated, you die. That's an important distinction, and I killed a character through it. So I feel a little bit bad. Brian, it was the one that was playing the clockwork to whom this happened. Thankfully, there was no hard feelings there, but yeah, that was... Teapot should not have died. That was a mistake on my part. Another thing that I just really would have liked to have gotten better at, there was a lot of referencing what Fortune did, and it's really simple, but I think the problem with why I kept having to re-reference Fortune is because it's a similar enough mechanic to Inspiration in D&D, and since I'm running my Thursday night D&D game, Fortune and Inspiration kept kind of mangling with each other in my brain, and it caused me to re-reference something that is actually not that complicated of a rule, but in addition, I would have liked to have had something maybe set up that was a little bit more hard of a reminder for some triggers to award Fortune, because what happened was, a lot of times I was like, oh, they're going into something big, I will give them Fortune because I want them to have the ability to decide whether to spend this or not. But really, it should have been more of a role-playing and story award thing that I was having triggered it. I was just wanting to make sure they had it at various times in the campaign so they knew what the mechanic felt like. So that was something I need to learn the triggers better, and I need to remember the mechanics behind it a little bit better. Getting used to spellcasting from the GM side was really interesting. There were 2 encounters in the campaign that were really spellcaster heavy. There was a cultist in the expert tier that they ran into, and I actually really liked how that encounter went. But I really had to stop and reread those rules, and he didn't drop anyone, but for one guy, he was actually fairly challenging for the party, and I was kind of glad how that went. And the other instance was the Lich, and I actually spent a couple hours writing up tactics and making sure I had spell references because I wanted the Lich to actually feel scary when I ran him. I think he did, and I'm also kind of glad that the party picked up on the environment and using the environment. And if you haven't watched the video, but there's a way that they triggered the environment so that the environment made the Lich less of a danger, because the party themselves probably would not have survived that if they had kept trying to go toe-to-toe with the Lich. Other thing that I messed up bad was permanent magic items. This is definitely one that the Sharkbone podcast brought up that I came to realize. Missed a whole section in the magic item chart when it says, you get this magic item, it does this thing 3 times. There is a follow-up paragraph that says, and then the next sunrise, you get to do it 3 more times. I was reading that as this magic item is a limited use. You get 3 times to use its magic, and then it's done. And apparently I'm not the only person that had read it that way, but I had missed that next section right behind it that said, and it refreshes the next day. That makes a world of difference when it comes to permanent magic items. It is kind of interesting that the game system didn't feel like permanent magic items working on a long-term basis was so necessary that me screwing up that rule ruined the campaign. But it is definitely a different feel to things. I like the way magic items work, where it's not just a static bonus and there's a little bit more to what they do. But yeah, I definitely made the mistake of not realizing that permanent magic items are actually permanent. You don't get this nifty magic item, then you can only use it 3 times ever in your entire lifetime. That was a mistake on my part. Definitely should have read that with a little bit more clarity. But I'm really glad the Sharkbone guys pointed that out. For player items, I think there were a couple times, and I wasn't going back through and recalculating things, but we had some issues where people would forget you were only taking the highest die, either boons or banes, and adding that to your roll. And there are a couple times I know it came through on in the actual play that people realized that they weren't supposed to be adding all of them in, and realized that their totals were too high. But I'm also pretty sure it snuck in a few times where that skewed the results one way or the other. It's not a big deal, but it was definitely something that, as the campaign went on and we had more boons and banes flying around, not just from the environment or from monsters, but actually from class abilities, that people were having to remember that, no, you're just taking the highest result and adding that to your thing. Even if you have 30 banes, you're only taking one of those and applying it to your roll, which is something I like about the system. It keeps the range of numbers within a certain set, and it doesn't get too ridiculous. But it's also something I think it's very easy, because other game systems don't do it this way, to forget and start thinking, oh, well, that was 18 extra points. And no, that's not 18. That's just whatever the highest one was there. So that was something that came up. And, you know, if I noticed it, if I thought a result seemed really high, I might have pointed it out, but I think most of the time it just kind of came up naturally. But yeah, it might have slipped in there a few times where that skewed things one way or the other. I would definitely like to run the game again. I don't think I did a stellar job. I think everybody had fun. I'm always pretty critical of my own GMing, and I'll get into that when I do my separate GMing lessons learned from this. But I thought it was enjoyable. I thought overall we got the general feeling of the game system. I like the game system. I like that it has a lot of customizable options, but it doesn't feel as complicated as some other game systems that have a comparable amount of options. So I really enjoyed that. I liked the tone and kind of the drive towards an endpoint. Not so much that, you know, oh, I don't want to play this for a long time, but I like it. There is a different feeling going into a campaign knowing that there is a limited number of sessions that you're playing, because in your head you can start working through these things, and knowing 10th level is the end point. That does create a little bit different narrative drive in your brain, and I kind of like it. I kind of enjoy it. So yeah, my overall takeaway from this is I would definitely like to run this again. I would definitely like to run it and try and remember these mistakes that I made and rectify them in the future. So that's been my quick run through of the campaign in general. And and before I go, I would like to point out, I've had other campaigns. I've planned out, I had a year-long DC Adventures game that I was running every other week, and I had this planned out. I think 90% of that campaign was great. We got to the end point with 2 different kind of boss battles that happened within the last 3 sessions, and I completely blew both of them, and I think they ruined the entire tone of the campaign. I'm still kicking myself over that, because it was like, wow, I did this year-long thing and we're building to this epic story, and I really completely ruined how they ended, and there's no emotional impact whatsoever. It's hard to say that it felt worthless, but it really felt like I did not stick the landing, and it upset me. On the other hand, I've run a 3-5 campaign that went to 13th level and had an intentional end, and it actually felt like an intentional epic ending, and I was really happy with how that one turned out. This one's probably not as epic as the 3.5 campaign was, but I don't feel as disappointed as the DC Adventures game. I think we had a really satisfying end. I think the final fight, it wasn't too easy, but it didn't, you know, completely wreck half the party. There were actually some character decisions that went into that final battle, and there was actually some nice epilogue information that we did at the end once we knew how the end played out. So I'm pretty happy with how it ended overall. I think we actually brought it to an interesting conclusion. So that is my campaign analysis for my Shadow of the Demon Lord game that I ran. Someday in the future, I would like to run it again. I do have a whole backload of other games that I need to read through and review and that I would like to play. I'm not sure if or when I'm going to be doing another online game soon. I would like to have a second game besides my Thursday D&D game, but I still need to get the logistics of that and make sure that I know what I'm doing beforehand and have, you know, take a little bit of best practices that I might have learned from this time around. But yeah, overall, not disappointed in the system at all. I had some really great players that really made it a fun game. I really enjoyed running this game for them. I'm hoping in the future I will get a chance to interview a few of them for some of these videos, just a short thing where I ask them a few questions about the campaign. Not sure if or when that's going to happen, but I would like to do it. But for now, that's my general broad overview analysis of running Shadow of the Demon Lord from 0 to 10th level. If you have any questions, get a hold of me either here on this video, on my blog, What Do I Know, the Games and Geekdom blog, or just look up Jared Rasher on Google Plus and talk to me there. I also have a Facebook page, What Do I Know, that is for the blog page where I post when I have a new blog post that's gone up. And just get a hold of me in one of those things. I will be glad to talk to you. If there's one thing that I can do, it is yammer on and on about games, whether I know anything about them or not. So, with all that having been said, if you got through this entire video, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you later.